Yo, what's good, people? In the next two videos, I'm going to be teaching you how to make dark trap melodies, and I'm going to be breaking down two loops from the kit. The first one is going to be Dungeons, and for the second one, I'll be breaking down more of a traditional dark trap melody. The second one's a bit simpler, which is why I wanted to include this one, just so I could teach you a few different processes. But the first one, Dungeons, sounds like this. It's one of my favorite loops. We've got two different sections. So yeah, some interesting texture. And I went through a lot of processing to get to the sound, which is why it's a good example to show you. But I'm going to explain things properly just so you know exactly what my thought process was and exactly how you can make these melodies. So the driving force of this melody is the mallets. Just simple, quite repetitive, but that was intentional. And the VST I'm using is Mallet Flux. I introduced you to this in the last video where I went through my plugins, but I used the Mallet Flux single preset, and initially it sounded like this. Really simple, but I'll break it down. And on that, I just had halftime with 4 times. Sometimes when I'm making melodies, I'll add halftime before I start making the melody, just because I know I'm going to want a dark vibe. And sometimes I just like to work backwards. I want to know how it's going to sound before I've added the plugin. Not everyone works like that, but sometimes I find it useful. There's just a couple of things you need to know if you're going to work like that. So I've got halftime set to 4 times, and I just had some reverb on there as well. You could ignore the other plugins. Sometimes they just experiment with different stuff. But if I take halftime off, it sounds strange. But it's because I was working backwards. So when you're working with halftime on, usually if you didn't have it on, it's going to pick up all the notes you add in this grid. But you'll see, if I added something here, it doesn't actually pick those notes up. And it's because I've got halftime on, and especially with 4 times. So if you had it on the normal setting, which is 2 times, it will pick up the notes within this section. But then when you've got it on 4 times, it's going to reset every bar. So we've got this first bar, and then the second bar, then the third bar. And you can see in the plugin, I've just got it looping every bar. Obviously that would change if you selected 2 bars. So I've got 4 times on. It's working with 1 bar. So it's only really going to pick up the notes in this section. And you'll also notice it looks kind of strange on the grid. And that's because I had this set to a 6 beat. Just gives it a bit of a different bounce compared to the normal grid. I usually use this if I'm going for something melodic, especially if I'm using guitars for things like gunner type beats. Now, you can see that I'm working in the key of E minor. And you don't always have to start with the root note, but in this case, I started with the E minor chord, and you can see that right here. You know it's a minor chord because there's 2 notes in between the bottom 2, and there's 3 notes in between the top 2. So you're just going from the first note up 3, so 1, 2, 3, and then up 4. Really simple minor chord. And then I've just got the root note E on top, just thickens it up a bit. And then also to create a dark and tense feeling, we can use semitones or half steps. A half step is just 1 note in between. So we've got 1 there and 1 there. We use those to create a bit of tension. So we've got this. And then in this section, we've still got the E minor chord, but I just brought the middle note down. Again, taking advantage of those half steps, but just creating a bit of a different vibe. And then I brought this up an octave and then played around with the notes there. So very simple notes, but that's all it needed. And I made it like this because I intentionally wanted to speed it up later on. I always like to render my MIDI to audio just to create some interesting textures, because when you render things or export things to audio and then manipulate the audio, you get certain artifacts that you wouldn't really get with just pitching up the melody and stretching the melody, or the MIDI, sorry. So I'll show you what I mean. So this is what that melody sounded like before I added anything, or before I changed the audio. So if I just reset the time and the pitch, I sent that to another insert. I added some RC20 just to give it a little bit of distortion and wobble, make it sound a bit more vintage. And then I added halftime again, but with just the standard settings, but I brought the mix right down. And this just gives it a little bit of low end, so you get that halftime effect, but it's not affecting the whole melody. So this is with it off, just like we had it, but now this just gives it a bit of low end. Almost adds a little lower melody. Then I took that, I made sure this stretch button was on, and then I just doubled the speed. And then I just played around with the key. And I ended up pitching it up by 500 cents, which is 5 semitones. And then I had this. And that to me just sounded perfect for what I was going for. Next thing I added was this piano. I broke down this VST in the last video as well, one of my favorite pianos. I just sort of went by ear with this one. And then just keeping in mind what I did for the main melody. So I started with an E minor chord, but now because we pitched it, it would start with an A minor chord. So the A minor would look like this. But you can play around with the middle note and just bring that down one, which is what I did for this chord. And then brought it up an octave. So this sounded right. And then I was just playing around with notes here. And that's kind of where trusting your ear comes into play. Doesn't have to be the exact same MIDI you started with. This just sounded right to me. And you'll notice that I also have halftime on that piano as well. And I just cut out some lows. So I had the main chords down, but I wanted a top line. And I thought a flute would work well with it. For the flute, I'm using Fender World 6 and the bamboo flute. And this is one of my favorite ones to use. And just a really simple melody. Just playing with velocity to keep it a bit more natural. And you'll notice with the notes, I'm not keeping everything perfectly on grid. If you do that, it can sound a bit too robotic. So I like to play around and think about how someone would actually play it. They're just not going to get everything perfectly on grid when they're playing. So it just helps it become a bit more human. After that, I wanted some low end. So I just felt like adding some piano bass notes would be the right way. And for the bass, I'm using my favorite piano, the Noir. And then even on this, I'm adding halftime to give it that dark vibe with some delay as well. So I've got the delay set to 4, just brought the level down. Just subtle, but I like the vibe of it. And then just to add some texture, I took one of the one shots from my kit, pitched it down so it matched the same key. It just gives it an interesting vibe. And then I thought I can't have that playing all the way through because it might get too repetitive. So I thought to switch it up, we could take the flute out and bring some vocals in. And usually I do that because if I had them playing together, I find that vocals and flutes tend to take up the same sort of frequency range. They can clash quite a bit. Sometimes it works, but in this case, I just wanted to save some space. So rather than having everything play together, I thought why not just have a second section to keep the beat interesting. For the vocals, I used Ethereal Gold and the 11 phrases. And then I just found some phrases that I like the sound of. To mix them, I just added an EQ to take out some highs and lows, and then just ducked this region here. Mainly because when artists jump on tracks, they take up a lot of the space, so I'm just thinking ahead. I did Pancake with the mix down, and this just pans it between both ears, but over time. And then because the mix is down, you're still going to hear it in the middle, but you'll also hear it moving between both sides. If you've got headphones on, you'll notice it. And then there's delay 3, the time set to 8, level down, cut off down, and then some reverb. And I always bring the low cut up with the reverb, just because when you start adding reverb to lower frequencies, that's where you can get a build-up of mud essentially. So the vocals without any effects, and then with, just makes it way more vibey. And then because I couldn't find the right vocal chart to link these two together, you'll see. Wasn't fully necessary because that still sounds good. But what I did was render the vocal. I reversed it, made sure it was in the right key, and I just changed the pitch of this one. Because it was just one note, I brought it down 5, and that note was still in the scale I was working in. So you'll see what I mean. So if I get rid of that. So because I brought it down, it's like I found my own vocal chop in there. And then you'll notice a different bass comes in this part as well. Again, just to add some variation. So this bass is the Jazzy bass in Analog Lab. And I'm just starting on the root note, but then coming down an octave. And then I've just used this as a passing note. Just like the way it sounded. And then 2 passing notes here. And then we've got a different vocal phrase. And you'll hear this top texture now, which I'll break down. So this is why I like to render melodies and manipulate them, just because you come up with things that you wouldn't normally find in a VST. If I showed you this and said, go find this in a VST, you'd be like, where do I even look for that? Now all this is just turn the effects off. It's that melody. So crazy flip. I just rendered that melody again. So same thing, I pitched it up an octave and turned the volume right down. And then if I turn the effects on, it's Portal doing that. So I added this bomb preset, and then I added the flasher preset. And this just completely transformed it and turned it into more of a texture. I added Shaper Box 3, and this is just making it start low and gradually come up. I added an EQ to cut out pretty much all of the lows and some of the highs. And then Pancake 2. This is just to pan it between both sides. So sometimes you don't need to think of more melodies. Sometimes you can just render the stuff you've got, flip it, and just add a variety of plugins just to see what interesting sounds you can get. And then you'll notice that I reintroduced the one shot. And again, just a different vocal phrase. And then I also added this texture, just very subtle. This is from my Planet Drill bundle. Then usually when I add textures, I'll just add something like EQ to take out any low end and high end if I feel like it's clashing. And then some reverb to make it sound like it's in the same environment as the rest of the melody. You'll also notice the only other thing I did was, so because we had this piano, if you listen to it here, there's a lot of low end. But in this part, we added a bass. So I didn't want the piano to clash with a bass. But I also didn't want to lose the low end from the piano in this section. So I just automated an EQ just by right clicking and selecting create automation clip. Where we don't have the bass, I've got the EQ off because it's not going to be clashing with anything. But then when the bass comes in, that's when the EQ can come on so that they're not fighting for space. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the melody. So I hope you found this useful. This is one of my favorite loops in the kit. There was a lot of processing in this one too, so I felt like it was just perfect fit for a course. But in the next one, we'll go through more of a traditional trap melody, and that one's a lot more simple.